It seems like everywhere you look these days, there's this huge push for active learning in STEM, especially at universities.
Yeah, that,
You've got groups like the AAU, the Association of American Universities, and the Carl Wyman Science Education Initiative. They're all really advocating for moving away from those traditional lectures. And the goals are really clear, right?
absolutely.
It's about improving how students do, getting more of them to stick with STEM fields, and tackling that whole issue of making STEM education more equitable.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that active learning is just like the better way to teach, that's really become dominant, you know.
Totally.
And you even hear these really strong statements about it.
Oh, yeah.
Like Carl Wyman, he's famously said that giving traditional lectures is like, pedagogically speaking, it's like bloodletting.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And Eric Mazur has been quoted saying that it almost feels unethical to lecture when the data supposedly shows active learning is so much more effective.
Right. So the implication there is that the research supporting active learning, it's just incredibly strong.
Yeah, it's cut and dry, supposedly.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what really got us intrigued for this deep dive.
Totally.
With everyone saying these really big things and active learning becoming so widespread, we thought, okay, let's really dig into the research behind it all. Let's see how solid that foundation of evidence actually is.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Exactly. That's the core of what we're trying to figure out today. We want to know if all these recommendations for active learning, if they're actually based on studies that were done really well.
Right, because it's one thing to just kind of look at the surface level and see that, oh, active learning seems to be working, but it's another to really dig into the methods and see if it's truly as effective as people are claiming.
Exactly.
So, for this deep dive, we've gone through a bunch of research on active learning in STEM.
Uh-huh.
We started with a really influential older study. It's that 2014 meta-analysis by Freeman and his colleagues.
Okay. Yeah.
And then we also looked at a lot of newer research that's come out between 2015 and 2022.
Okay, great. So before we jump into the findings, I think it's important to define what we're actually talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely.
When we say active learning in this context, what does that actually mean?
That's a key question because active learning can mean different things to different people.
For sure.
But in a broad sense, in this research, active learning means that students are actively involved in the learning process.
Right, not just sitting there passively.
Exactly. It's not just like a traditional lecture where they're passively absorbing information. It could involve things like responding to clicker questions during class, working together with other students to solve problems, like in groups, or analyzing case studies.
Uh-huh.
The key is that the students are actively participating and really thinking, not just listening to the instructor talk.
Exactly. Yeah. And something that really struck me as I was going through all this is even with this kind of general definition of active learning, there's still so much variation in how it's actually put into practice.
Yeah.
Like even in that Freeman meta-analysis, they pointed out that active learning could be anything from like just having students do group work sometimes to using those personal response systems, those clickers,
Right.
or even having completely different structures for the whole course.
That's a really important point. You can't just assume that all active learning is created equal.
Right.
So when you're comparing studies, it's not always as simple as saying, okay, this study used active learning and this study used lecture. It's more nuanced than that.
It definitely makes it more challenging to kind of compare apples to apples.
Right. And that's why, for us, focusing on the quality of the research itself was so crucial.
Uh-huh.
In educational studies, and especially when we're looking at the science of learning, making sure those studies are well designed is absolutely essential.
Yeah, we have to be able to trust the results.
Exactly. We need to be confident that if we see active learning seeming to have a positive impact, it's actually because of those active learning methods, and not just because of some other random factor that the researchers didn't control for in the study.
So it's not just about whether active learning seems to work better on the surface. It's about whether the studies were actually set up in a way that can show convincingly that active learning was the reason for those better results.
Exactly. It's all about cause and effect. We want to be sure that the active learning is causing the improvement, not something else. And that's where methodological rigor comes in. It's a fancy way of saying, how well was the study done?
Right.
And a big part of that is what we call internal validity controls. These are the specific things that researchers do in their study design to make sure that their intervention, in this case active learning, is really what's causing the changes they see in student learning.
So to really understand the research on active learning, we need to get into the nitty-gritty of how these studies were actually conducted.
Right, because it's not enough to just say, active learning seems to be better. We need to look under the hood and see if the research backs that up.
Yeah, exactly. And to do that, the researchers behind this review took a two-pronged approach.
Uh-huh.
First, they really dug deep into those 187 articles that were included in that big 2014 Freeman meta-analysis, the one we talked about
Yeah, the
earlier.
one that's been cited like career.
Exactly. They were able to track down and analyze 176 of those articles, which represented 223 separate studies.
Wow, that's a lot of studies.
Yeah, it's a lot. They did have to leave out a few articles, though,
Uh-huh.
like studies that weren't in STEM fields, or review articles that just summarized other research, or articles that described teaching methods but didn't actually compare them to anything else.
Right, those wouldn't be very helpful for figuring out if active learning is actually better.
Exactly.
So they focused on the 176 that had those good, solid comparisons.
Okay. And for those articles, they had a specific set of quality indicators that they used to evaluate them, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They looked at 12 key internal validity controls to assess the quality of each study.
Okay.
And then, for the newer research, the stuff published between 2015 and 2022, they did their own really thorough search across a bunch of different academic databases. Like, they looked into Web of Science, PubMed, ERIC, Engineering Village, and even dissertations and theses global.
Wow. So they really cast a wide net.
Yeah, they wanted to be comprehensive,
Uh-huh.
and they had specific criteria for which studies they would include. Like, the study had to directly compare active learning to either traditional lecture or another active learning method. It had to focus on undergraduate STEM courses, college-level STEM.
Right.
And it had to involve face-to-face teaching that happened during a regular academic year, not like summer courses or anything.
Okay.
They also wanted studies that reported actual data on student performance, like how well the students did on tests or assignments.
Right. That makes sense. You need to see how the different teaching methods actually affected student learning.
Exactly. And they needed the studies to have a clearly defined control group. The group that's taught using the traditional method that's being compared to the active learning method.
Makes sense. So after all that searching and filtering, how many articles from that newer period did they end up with?
Well, they started with thousands of articles.
Yeah.
But after they applied all those specific criteria, they narrowed it down to 260 articles published between 2015 and 2022.
Okay.
And then from those 260, they randomly picked 84 articles to do that same in-depth analysis, looking at those 12 internal validity controls.
Okay, got it. So they've got these two groups of studies, the ones from that big Freeman meta-analysis and then this sample of newer research. And they use those same 12 checks for internal validity on both. Can you remind me what those controls are again?
Yeah, absolutely. Those 12 controls, they're really essential for figuring out if a study can actually show that one thing caused another thing to happen. Like, in this case, did active learning cause students to learn better?
Right.
So they looked at the overall research design of the study.
Huh? Was it a randomized controlled trial, which is considered the gold standard?
Okay.
Or was it a different type of design?
Right, because not all research designs are created equal.
Exactly. And they looked at group equivalence. Basically, were the groups of students similar to each other at the beginning of the study?
Okay.
And they looked at that in two ways. Directly related to what was being taught in the course, so things like pretests on the course material, and then indirectly related factors, like their prior academic performance, their GPAs, or their scores on standardized tests.
Makes sense. You want to make sure you're comparing groups that are starting out at roughly the same level.
Exactly. And they looked at something called attrition equivalency. That basically means, did students drop out of the study at similar rates in both groups, and were the reasons for dropping out similar?
Okay, so you don't want to have one group where a bunch of students are dropping out and the other group where everyone's staying in.
Exactly. That can really mess with the results.
Yeah, makes sense. And they also considered whether the sample sizes were matched.
Meaning the groups were about the same size?
Yeah.
Okay.
They looked at whether the same instructor taught all the groups or if different instructors were involved. And they looked for a clear operational definition of both the active learning method and the lecture method.
So, specifically, what did the active learning involve? What
Yeah.
did the lecture involve?
Exactly. And how did the researchers define those things?
Okay.
They looked at whether the dosage of the interventions was described and matched.
Dosage meaning, the amount of time spent on each teaching method?
Exactly, like the amount of instructional time or the number of activities, things like that.
Okay.
They also considered whether the interventions happened during the same time frame.
Like, were both groups taught in the same semester,
Right.
or were they in different semesters?
Exactly. That can be a factor, too. They looked at whether the content covered in both conditions was the same. Were they learning the same material? And they looked at whether the dependent measures, those are the assessments used to measure student learning, whether those were equal for all groups.
So, like, were all the students taking the same tests or doing the same assignments?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, they looked at something called implementation fidelity. That basically means, did the teachers actually teach the way they were supposed to according to the study protocol? Did they actually do the active learning activities or deliver the lectures as planned?
Okay, so they were checking to see if the teaching methods were actually carried out as intended.
Exactly. It's not enough to just say you're going to do active learning. You have to actually do it.
Right.
And all of these controls, they're important because any one of these things could potentially affect the result of the study.
Yeah, so it's like a checklist for making sure the study was done rigorously.
Exactly. And for each of these controls, there's an ideal scenario. Like for research design, a randomized controlled trial is ideal. For group equivalents, you want the groups to be as similar as possible on all those relevant characteristics before this study even starts. You want to start with a level playing field.
Right.
And for attrition, ideally you'd have very little dropout in either group, and if there is dropout, you want it to be similar in both groups.
Okay.
And so on for all the other controls. Like ideally you'd have similar class sizes, the same instructor teaching both groups, really clear and specific descriptions of what active learning and lecture looked like in that particular study, the same amount of teaching time and the same material covered, everything happening in the same time frame, the same tests or assignments being used to measure learning, and really strong evidence that the teaching methods were actually delivered the way they were planned.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's a lot to keep track of.
it is. But all of these factors are important for making sure that the study is really measuring the effect of the teaching method and not just some other random factor.
Right. So with all those 12 controls in mind, let's see what the review actually found. Let's start with those articles from the Freeman meta-analysis. What were some of the general characteristics of those studies? Like what subjects were they in? What were they comparing? Things like that.
Okay, so in terms of the subjects, most of them, almost 78%, were in math, biology, physics, and chemistry or engineering.
Okay, so pretty standard STEM fields.
Yeah. And the most common comparison they were making, not surprisingly, was between active learning and traditional lecture.
Uh-huh.
That made up almost 90% of the articles. Most of those interventions, about 83.5%, they happened over a whole semester or a whole quarter.
Okay.
And when it came to how they measured student learning, the most common method, it was used either by itself in about 43% of the articles or combined with other methods in almost 70%, was using assessments that were created either by the researchers or the instructors themselves, or they came from test banks.
Okay, so not like standardized tests or anything like that.
Right.
Okay. And what about the results in those Freeman studies? What did they generally show about how well students did in the active learning versus lecture conditions?
Well, the findings definitely fit with that whole idea that active learning is better.
Oh.
The groups that were doing the active learning, they showed statistically significantly greater improvement, like a real measurable difference in almost 30% of the articles.
Wow.
And in another 14.8% of the articles, they did better, but it wasn't statistically significant, meaning the difference could have just been due to chance.
Okay.
Now, on the flip side, the groups that had the traditional lectures, they only showed statistically significantly greater improvement in a tiny percentage of the articles, like only 0.6%.
Wow, that's a big difference.
Yeah. And their performance was better, but not statistically significant, in just 2.8% of the articles.
Okay.
So overall, about 65% of the articles showed that active learning was better for student performance, while only 4% favored lecture.
Okay, so that does seem like pretty strong support for active learning based on those studies.
Yeah, at least on the surface.
Right.
But remember, we still need to look at those internal validity controls.
Exactly. What about how students felt about the different teaching methods? Did the researchers look at that at all?
That's interesting because student preference actually wasn't reported in most of the Freeman studies.
Really?
Yeah, almost 63% of them didn't mention it at all.
Huh.
But in the studies that did report on student preference, they generally liked the active learning conditions better.
Okay.
About 27% of those studies that reported preference showed that. And only a really small number showed students preferring lecture.
Okay, so based on those results and just the general characteristics of those studies, it definitely seems like the Freeman meta-analysis supports shifting towards active learning.
Yeah, it does. But remember, that's before we really dig into the quality of the studies themselves.
Right.
The real test is looking at those 12 internal validity controls.
Exactly. So, what did the review find when they took a closer look at those controls in those same Freeman studies?
This is where it gets really interesting and honestly a little concerning.
Okay.
When they looked at the research designs, they found that most of the studies, over 88% of them, used quasi-experimental designs.
Quasi-experimental meaning.
It means that they weren't the gold standard randomized controlled trials. They often involved comparing groups that weren't randomly assigned, or they compared the same group of students at different times.
Oh, okay.
Like, they might compare students in one section of a course that used active learning to students in another section of the same course that had traditional lectures. But the students weren't randomly assigned to those sections. They might have chosen them for whatever reason.
Right, so there could be other differences between those groups of students that are affecting the results.
Exactly. Or they might compare how the same group of students did on a test before and after they had some kind of active learning intervention. But then, maybe something else changed during that time that could explain the results.
Right, yeah.
So only about 10% of the studies actually used randomized controlled trials, which is the best way to make sure that the groups you're comparing are truly comparable.
Okay, so that already raises some questions about how strong the conclusions can be from these studies.
Absolutely.
What about that issue of making sure the groups of students were similar to begin with? That seems really important for being able to say that it was the active learning that caused the better outcomes.
It's completely crucial.
Yeah.
And this is where they found some big weaknesses. For those direct measures of group equivalence, things like giving students a pretest on the course material before the study starts to see if they're starting out at the same level, that wasn't even reported in almost 73% of the articles.
Wow, so we have no idea if the groups were similar to begin with in most of these studies.
Right. And of the studies that did report on direct measures of group equivalence, only about 23% of them actually showed evidence that the groups were truly equivalent.
Okay, so even when they tried to check, it often turned out that the groups weren't that similar.
Exactly.
And what about the indirect measures like GPA and stuff?
It's pretty similar there, too. Indirect measures of group equivalence, those weren't included in almost half of the articles. And again, only a small percentage of the studies that did report on those measures actually showed that the groups were equivalent on those factors. So if you've got a study where the students in the active learning group already had higher GPAs to begin with, or they did better on standardized tests, then the improvements you see in their learning might not actually be because of the active learning.
Right, it could just be because they were already higher achieving students.
Exactly.
So that lack of demonstrating that the groups were really similar at the start, that seems like a major problem if you're trying to say that active learning caused those better results.
It's a huge problem. It means we can't really be sure what's causing the differences we're seeing.
Yeah. Were there any other control issues that they uncovered in these studies?
Yeah, attrition was another big one,
Attrition, meaning?
meaning students dropping out of the study.
Oh, right, right.
So information about how many students dropped out, that was missing from over 58% of the articles.
Wow. So again, we just don't know in a lot of cases.
Right.
Yeah.
And in the 15% of articles where the attrition was higher than 30%, meaning more than 30% of the students dropped out, it was mostly what we call differential attrition.
And what does that mean?
It means that students were dropping out at different rates in the active learning group compared to the lecture group, or the students who dropped out had different characteristics.
Okay, so can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, imagine you have a study where the students in the traditional lecture class, they're finding the material really dry and boring.
Mm-hmm.
And so they start dropping out. But the students in the active learning class, they're more engaged, they're finding it more interesting, so they're staying in the course. If you then see that the students in the active learning group are doing better overall, is that because of the active learning? Or is it just because the students who were less motivated or struggling more, they left the lecture group? That's the problem with differential attrition.
It makes it really hard to tell what's really causing the differences in the outcomes.
Exactly.
Okay, so attrition is another big issue. Were there any others?
Yeah, they also found problems with sample sizes, instructors, and even when the interventions happened. Like, the sample sizes often weren't well matched between the groups.
Meaning the active learning group might have had way more students than the lecture group, or vice versa.
Right.
Okay.
And that was reported in almost half of the articles. And this is kind of surprising, but even though Freeman and his colleagues initially said they only included studies with the same instructor teaching both groups, when they actually looked at the studies, they found that almost half of them actually used different instructors for the active learning and the lecture groups.
Wow, that's a pretty big discrepancy.
It is.
And I can imagine having different instructors could really affect how the teaching methods are actually implemented and how well the students learn.
Absolutely. Some instructors are just naturally more engaging or better at explaining things than others.
Right.
So that's a big confound. And then on top of that, almost half of the studies actually implemented the active learning and the lecture conditions at different times.
Naming.
Meaning, like, one group might have been taught in the fall semester and the other group in the spring semester.
Oh,
Or one group was taught one year and the other group was taught a different year. And that introduces a whole bunch of other potential factors that could be affecting the results.
right. Like maybe the students in the different semesters or years are just different.
Exactly.
Or maybe the curriculum changed or the whole university environment changed.
Right. And that makes it really hard to say for sure that any differences you see are because of the teaching method.
Yeah, it makes the comparisons a lot less clear.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got different instructors, potentially different student populations to start with, different dropout rates, and even different semesters or years. It's starting to feel like it's pretty hard to isolate the impact of the teaching method itself with all these other factors going on.
It definitely makes you wonder.
Yeah. And what about how clearly the studies define what they meant by active learning and lecture? Did the reviewers find any issues there?
Yeah, the operational definitions, the way they describe those key terms, that was another area where they saw a lot of variation and often a lack of detail.
Okay.
So, while about half of the studies did a good job of clearly defining all the parts of their active learning intervention, less than 20% did the same for the lecture condition.
Really? So they were much less specific about what they considered lecture to be.
Yeah, exactly. And in almost half of the studies, they didn't clearly define the features of the lecture condition at all.
Wow.
So it makes it really hard to know exactly what they were comparing.
Yeah, because lecture can mean so many different things.
It can.
Like, it could be a really engaging interactive lecture where the instructor is asking questions and getting students involved, or it could be a really dry, boring lecture where the instructor is just talking at the students the whole time.
Exactly. And if you don't define what you mean by lecture, it's hard to know what kind of lecture they were using in the study and how that might have affected the results.
Right. Makes sense. What about the dosage of the interventions? Did they find any issues there?
Yeah, they did.
Okay.
The dosage, meaning things like how much time was spent on each teaching method or how many activities were involved, that was often not well specified or not matched between the groups.
Okay, so you might have an active learning intervention that takes up like a whole class period every week, and then a lecture condition that's only like 30 minutes once a week.
Exactly.
And then it's hard to say if any differences in learning are because of the teaching method itself or just because the students are getting more exposure to one method than the other. Okay, so it seems like there were quite a few weaknesses in how those studies were conducted, which is kind of surprising because those were the studies that formed the basis of that really influential Freeman meta-analysis. What was the reviewers' overall assessment of the rigor across all those controls?
So in their analysis, they actually tried to be pretty generous to give the studies the benefit of the doubt.
Okay.
Like if information was missing, they didn't automatically count it against the study. And they also allowed for partial definitions of things like active learning and lecture.
Okay.
But even with that leniency, only the tiny fraction of the studies, only 2.3%, met almost all of those 11 key internal validity controls.
Wow, that's really low. And they didn't even include implementation fidelity in that analysis.
Right, they left that one out. And they also didn't count indirect measures of group equivalence if the study showed direct equivalence. So they were really trying to be generous here. But if they had counted not specified as not meeting the control, that percentage would have dropped to less than 1%. And if they had included implementation fidelity, which was rarely reported as having happened, it would have dropped to 0.
Wow, so basically none of the studies met all the criteria for strong internal validity.
Yeah, it's pretty concerning.
What's even more alarming is that 100% of the studies, every single one, had at least one issue with internal validity.
Yeah, and the majority of them, over 60%, met half or fewer of the internal validity controls.
That's a pretty far cry from the kind of really strong, definitive claims that are often made about the effectiveness of active learning based on this research?
It really makes you think twice about how much we can really trust those claims.
Yeah. So, given all that, what did they find when they looked at the more recent research, the studies from 2015 to 2022?
Okay.
Were there any signs that things were getting better, that researchers were paying more attention to those methodological details?
Unfortunately, not really. The trends were mostly the same.
Oh, that's disappointing.
Yeah. In terms of the subjects, engineering became the most common one, followed by chemistry, computer science, math, and biology. But the comparison between active learning and lecture, that was still the most frequent one.
Uh-huh.
And the length of the interventions and the types of assessments they used, those were also pretty similar to the Freeman-era studies. The results still generally favored active learning. About 64% of the studies showed some benefit for the active learning group in terms of student performance. But again, data on student preference, that was still missing from most of the studies.
Okay, so not much change there.
Right.
But the big question is, when they really dug into those internal validity controls in these newer studies, did they see any improvement in the way they were conducted?
Sadly, no, not really.
Oh, come on.
It's frustrating.
Oh, yeah.
Like you'd think with all the attention on active learning, researchers would be paying more attention to these things.
Right.
But the research designs were still mostly quasi-experimental. That whole issue of group equivalence, both the direct and indirect measures, that was still often not addressed in the reports. Information about student attrition, how many students dropped out, that was still missing from a lot of the studies. And probably most concerningly, implementation fidelity was still only reported in less than 10% of the articles.
Wow. So even after that Freeman meta-analysis highlighted how important these methodological details are, the newer research wasn't really doing much better.
That's the thing. And it's kind of a bummer because it seems like we're not really learning from our mistakes.
Yeah, exactly. It makes you wonder if the focus on active learning is maybe overshadowing the need for doing really good, solid research.
I think there's a lot of enthusiasm for active learning, and that's great, but we need to make sure that enthusiasm is tempered by good science.
Absolutely. So if we put together the findings from those older studies that were in the Freeman meta-analysis and then this newer sample of research, what's the main takeaway? What should we be concluding from all of this?
Okay, so the big picture here is that while the research does seem to suggest that active learning is probably more effective than traditional lecture in STEM, we need to be really cautious about how confident we are in that conclusion.
Uh-huh.
Because, and this is the important part, there are some serious and consistent weaknesses in the way a lot of these studies were done, both the older ones and the newer ones. And those methodological flaws, they're casting a shadow of doubt on how strong the evidence for active learning really is.
Okay, so for me, the main point here is that we shouldn't just take those claims about active learning at face value.
Yeah, exactly.
We need to understand that the research might not be as clear-cut as it seems on the surface.
Exactly.
Doesn't necessarily mean active learning isn't better, but it does mean